History is a funny concept. On one hand, most people see historical events as indisputable facts. But time after time, our understanding of history evolves. New evidence is discovered. Old evidence becomes unreliable. Ancient cities are discovered on the ocean floor or buried in the middle of the desert, throwing doubt onto everything we know. Make no mistake, history is not written in stone, and our understanding of what came before is fluid, constantly shifting and providing new insight. Of course, none of us can go back in time and see what really happened, and in the end, we must all rely on historians and experts, without actually seeing and assessing the evidence for ourselves. History is written by the victor, as they say. But what if everything you know is a lie? What if human history, the history of our entire planet, is completely different than what you've been led to believe? How would you ever know? What if people are going their entire lives with a totally warped view of history? This was exactly what Anatoly Timofeyevich Fomenko believed when he proposed a very, very different view of world history. Something he called the new chronology, rejecting virtually everything we know about our time on the planet. Fomenko argues that the official story has been twisted and manipulated to serve the elite. But what exactly is this new chronology? Does it actually make sense? Could Fomenko really be telling the truth? Let's find out.
There's 51 million people entering another
surveillance camera capturing the
unidentified flying
lockdowns and mass testing.
Today, that the world is going to end.
Anatoly Fomenko is still alive, and he was born at the tail end of World War II in 1945. Raised in the USSR, Fomenko currently serves as a professor at the Moscow State University. A highly competent mathematician, he eventually emerged as one of the world's most well-known conspiracy theorists. Although he wasn't solely responsible for the new chronology, he was probably the most influential figure who popularized it with books like History, Fiction, or Science, which was first published in Russia during the early 1980s. Eventually, it became extremely popular among conspiracy theorists, especially in Russia. In fact, some studies show that up to 30% of Russians believe in Fomenko's new chronology. It's also worth mentioning that it's a collaborative effort, with numerous mathematicians working together with Fomenko to compile and publish the books. Before we get into the new chronology itself, it's important to understand why Fomenko thinks our understanding of history is completely incorrect. Some of his claims are a little outlandish to say the least, but they may be a little easier to entertain if you know how he came to his conclusions. First of all, he doubts the validity of virtually all historical records before the 11th century. Some of these records are completely lost, while others are the result of inconsistent timekeeping methods, unreliable writers, and a range of other factors. He also believes that pre-Renaissance history was the result of a conspiracy involving the Catholic Church. According to Fomenko, the Vatican wanted to ensure their version of history reigned supreme. Perhaps more crucially, the Church wanted mainstream history to reflect the events depicted in the Bible. There is at least some truth to this, as the Catholic Church has indeed exercised considerable influence over our modern understanding of history, especially when it comes to biblical events. Fomenko points specifically to a French scholar named Joseph Scaliger, who was responsible for piecing together the foundation of our modern historical chronology. Of course, Fomenko wasn't the first person to criticize modern interpretations of historical events, as individuals like Jean Hardwin had doubted the validity of ancient historical documents way back in the 17th century. Hardwin famously claimed that most Greek and Roman texts had been forged by Benedictine monks. Even Sir Isaac Newton had his doubts about the official story, and the historian Edwin Johnson believed that all early Christian history was completely unreliable, having been fabricated in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So how did Fomenko actually back up his claims? Essentially, he argues that many historical events were duplicated by early writers who wanted to stretch history further back in time. If they wanted to write about an event that occurred thousands of years ago, they would simply take a more modern event, change the names and a few details, and rewrite that event to create fake early history. Fomenko claims that in some cases, these historical inaccuracies were a result of laziness or record-keeping accidents. But in other cases, these phantom histories were created intentionally to serve the interests of the elite. A trained mathematician, Fomenko set out to prove this theory using statistical correlation. He analyzed a number of historical figures and determined which ones were most similar. After years of study, he began to believe that many of these historical figures were actually the same people. They had remarkably similar names, lived for about the same amount of time, and died in the exact same way. Finally, Fomenko pointed out astronomical evidence to support his claims. We know that the Star of Bethlehem went supernova around 1140 AD, but he says that this was the same astronomical event as the crucifixion eclipse and a total solar eclipse that occurred in 1185. He also argues that a star catalog created by Ptolemy was actually compiled in the 15th and 16th century. Furthermore, Fomenko believes that Dendera horoscopes found on the Temple of Hathor in Egypt actually correspond to dates in the 11th or 13th century. Throughout his writings, he refers to the mention of certain lunar eclipses that could not have happened during those time periods, eventually realizing that there were considerable inconsistencies in historical accounts of lunar cycles. Finally, Fomenko believes that modern scientific methods like radiocarbon dating and dendrochronology are completely unreliable. For those that don't know, dendrochronology involves measuring tree rings to determine the dates of certain events. So based on all of these methods, what was Fomenko left with? What is his version of history? Prepare yourselves, because this is going to sound extremely out there. Let's start at the beginning. According to Fomenko, the history of humanity only goes back as far as 800 AD. It isn't exactly clear what he believes was happening before this date, but Fomenko insists that virtually all historical events occurred between the year 1000 and 1500 AD. So what were these historical events? First of all, he believes that Jesus was actually crucified around 1185 in Constantinople. He also states that many others are simply copies of this prototypical Jesus figure, including a Byzantine emperor, Pope Gregory VII, the biblical Elisha, and even a Chinese emperor. In addition, Fomenko claims that the Trojan Wars and the Holy Crusades were actually the same thing, and that they were sparked by Christians who wanted revenge for the crucifixion that occurred in 1185. But what about ancient Rome and all of its reliable historical records? Fomenko states that the Roman Empire was actually a combination of the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Byzantines. According to him, Rome was founded in the year 1380 AD. Fomenko also focuses heavily on the Bible, claiming that Noah is actually just a carbon copy of Christopher Columbus. This is a common theme throughout the New Chronology, with Fomenko stating that a vast number of individuals are one and the same. For example, according to him, Solomon was actually the Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent. But perhaps the most important claim made by Fomenko has to do with Russia. He states that history was manipulated to hide the truth, that there was once a huge global empire run by the Russian people. He refers to this as the Russian Horde, claiming that Genghis Khan and the Mongols were a part of it. But they weren't Mongolian, they were Russian. Fomenko even states that at one point the Russians controlled vast portions of North America, which was considered to be part of the Russian Empire as late as the 1700s. Furthermore, he states that the ancient Egyptian pyramids are just Russian tombs, and that the story of Moses crossing the Red Sea is really just a story about Russians crossing the Bosporus to conquer Turkey. There have been many criticisms of the New Chronology over the years. First off, it's important to point out the obvious. This retelling of history is extremely biased towards Russia. It seems a little suspicious that Fomenko came to the conclusion that Russia once ruled the world as the Third Roman Empire, especially during a time when nationalism and propaganda were at an all-time high during the Cold War in the Soviet Union. Others point to the fact that the statistical correlation between major historical figures isn't actually as accurate as Fomenko claims. For example, he points out that some kings and rulers are the same people, despite them having different lifespans, different ages, and different reigns. And then you have to consider the fact that radiocarbon dating is quite well established in the field of science. Even if you were to doubt this, the process of dating events using tree rings is basically irrefutable. Finally, we have to consider the fact that many ancient empires, including the ancient Romans, were meticulous record keepers who were extremely detailed when it came to historical events. Even though many of these records might have been lost, a vast number still exist to this day, and it's difficult to completely deny their authenticity. At the end of the day, Fomenko's ideas are extremely interesting. Is his version of history completely correct? Probably not. But with that said, we can take important lessons away from the New Chronology, because much of what Fomenko says is in fact correct. The Catholic Church really did have an incredible power and influence over our understanding of ancient history. The clergy were the only ones who could read and write, and people a few hundred years ago simply had to accept whatever they were told by the Church without question. In many ways, mainstream science has fallen into a similar pattern. They are the gatekeepers, the ones who are capable or allowed to interpret the data and come to conclusions. What they say is considered law, arguing with science is blasphemy, and we have no way of knowing whether they are representing data in a truthful manner. Many records were indeed forged and altered during medieval times. If nothing else, the new chronology is a lesson in critical thinking. Question everything, and find the answers for yourselves. Because you never know, everything you've been told may be a lie.